Psalm 124, verse 1, here David going ahead and speaking about the protection that God has given, he says this. He says, "Had it not been the Lord who was on our side," let Israel now say, "had it not been the Lord who was on our side when men rose up against us, then they would have swallowed us alive. When their anger was kindled against us, the waters would have engulfed us. The stream would have swept over our soul. The raging waters would have swept over our soul." Here, as David goes ahead and talks about this protection that the Lord had given, he says that if it wasn't for the Lord's protection, if it wasn't for the Lord being on their side, that they would have been swept away. They would have had no chance to be able to overcome the ferocity of the enemy. And when we talk about the enemy that they were suffering, the things that they were dealing with, he goes ahead and he describes the enemy or the dealings that the enemies were giving to them, the things that were happening. He describes them in a couple of different ways. He says that they were like waters that engulfed them. They were like the stream that would have swept over their soul. They were like raging waters that were swept over their soul. And he uses that analogy to kind of paint a picture. And I wanted to tonight use a similar type of analogy for us today. Looking at that and then having a comparison that we can draw off of this specific analogy, and that is the analogy of a river, to go ahead and determine what is our determination as Christians. What should our determination and our drive as Christians look like? And to aid me, I want to look at a river's lifespan. Now, when we talk about the river's lifespan, some may go and say, well, what does that have to do with my spirituality? Well, I will go ahead and expand on that. But we can go ahead and learn a lot from God's creation. The very simple things in life can teach us so many different things. And I think it is on purpose that the Lord has done that. And Christ gives so many different analogies and parables and uses everyday things in this world to teach us a lesson. And here, using the river's life cycle, I think we can learn a lot about us as Christians and how we need to go ahead and develop throughout our lives. So, talking about the early part of a river. When we look at a river, the very first portion of a river, as it comes and is conceived, as it goes ahead and is born, we see that the river has great strength. As a matter of fact, the more source it has, the more massive strength it has. And it can move trees and boulders. It can cut through canals and cut canals through mountains. The river has massive strength. So massive is its path is straight. It is not diverted in any way. It's not diminished in any way. It has a straight path. Now, as the river's life continues and the source kind of diminished, it goes into what we call meandering. And a meandering river is simply meaning that the river starts to kind of do this serpentine kind of diverting. And what it does is it is now doesn't have the same full strength that it used to. It now avoids those things, those obstacles that are in its way. And it begins to widen its path, looking like this serpentine. No longer is it this straight path that it used to have. But as this goes on, nature goes ahead and takes its course. The sediment starts to settle, the trees start to grow, and overgrowth starts to take over. And this meandering path begins to widen more and more until finally it is just pockets of stagnant ponds. And then little by little those ponds evaporate and go away and are choked off by the things of the world. You know, when we look at that and we ponder that analogy, I think it's easy to see that there is great importance when we look at our own spirituality and the things that we're doing and how we're doing it, that we want to avoid falling into the life cycle of that river. We want to stay in one specific way, and we need to take an understanding on how a river works so that we can go ahead and do the exact same thing. The title of today's lesson is The Mighty River. And I want to go ahead and examine those traits that river has and then compare it to some of the traits that we have so that we can gain an application in our lives and how we need to be strong in our faith. So let's look at the first one. The first comparison that is made, the first trait that we can find from a river, is that a river draws its strength from its source. You see, a river has to have a source. It has to come from somewhere. And in the same fashion, we as Christians, we also draw strength from a source. And the source must be from God. Just as the psalmist writes in Psalm 125, verse 1 and 2. If you turn there in Psalm 125, verses 1 and 2, here the psalmist goes ahead and he says that God is that source of strength for each and every one of his people. He says, those who trust in the Lord are as Mount Zion, which cannot be moved but abide forever. As mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people from this time forth and forever. Here we see again also in Isaiah chapter 41, verse 10. In Isaiah chapter 41, verse 10, here Isaiah going ahead while offering this encouragement, these encouraging words of God's faithfulness and his power. He says this, he says, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not anxiously look about, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, surely I will help you, surely I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. In both of these passages, we are plainly assured that God is and should always be the source of strength for us as Christians. And sometimes we look at that and we may not quite get that, even though it's such a clear and easy thing to understand. We must draw from the root. You know, Christ goes ahead and he says that we can bear absolutely no fruit without him. We must be grafted into the root to be able to draw from the Lord. As a matter of fact, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 17 and 18, Timothy is told by Paul how Paul, even though he was abandoned abandoned by the people that he knew, abandoned by the acquaintances he had, by the people that he trusted, he was abandoned when he was taken into custody. And in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 17, he says, but you know what? The Lord didn't abandon me. He says, but the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that through me the proclamation might be fully accomplished. And he goes in verse 18 and he says, the Lord will rescue me from every evil deed, and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. Here we see that Paul goes ahead and he trusts fully in God. Not only that God has done things for him in the past, but he fully is assured that God will help him in the future as well. He also goes ahead and states this. Look in Philippians chapter 4. Well-known verses to us. In Philippians chapter 4, beginning in verse 11. Philippians chapter 4, beginning in verse 11. I'm going to just go up here in Philippians chapter 4. He goes ahead and he says that he is receiving some support. By the church of Philippi is going ahead and assisting Paul, and he goes ahead and he thanks them for that. And he says this, not that I am speaking from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. He says, I know how to get along in humble means. I also know how to live in prosperity. And in everything and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. And what is that message? What is the secret that Paul is talking about? He says the secret is, in verse 13, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Paul understood that the only source of strength that he had was God. It wasn't his own strength. And this is an apostle that had the power of the Lord behind him. But he says, the only strength that I have is God-given strength. We must draw our strength from God. But the next characteristic that we see from a river is that a strong river, allows nothing to divert it. It goes through everything. And as Christians, we cannot allow ourselves to be diverted from our path either. You see, creation has proven to us something very, very plain to see. With enough force, with enough pressure, a river, any river, can go ahead and destroy and make destruction out of any place. It will go through a path that will carve its way through, no matter what is in its way. Its path will not be denied. So I ask, do we have that type of determination? Are we like that raging river, the one that will not be denied from our path? Are we walking in that path and will not divert from it? See, we can't allow ourselves to be diverted from the path that we've been set on. Because we know it's the only path that God has given to us. And the minute we start diverting from it, we start meandering. We start losing track. This is exactly why Christ said, when he was talking about the parable of the soils in Luke chapter 8, verse 14, when he's talking about those parable of the soils, remember how Christ goes in and mentions the parable of the soil, and he says that there is one type of soil, the soil that goes ahead and has the thorny soil. And what happens to that seed that it gets planted there? It starts to grow, but unfortunately it never bears fruit. Why? Because it is choked out by the worries and the cares of this world, the pleasures of this life, the riches of the world. Truth is that it is easy, and I say it again, it is easy for us to fall into this trap. It's easy for us to go ahead and fall into Satan's disguised trap for us. You see, Satan doesn't go ahead and put blatantly inherent kind of sinful things right in front of a strong Christian and say, hey, is he going to take the bait? Because if we see those are blatantly obvious, we don't normally go ahead and do those things. But what Satan does is he doesn't go ahead and give us something that is easy to distinguish. Instead, he packages it up and things that aren't blatantly and utterly sinful. You see, Satan goes ahead and uses things like our jobs, our families, our health, our financial responsibilities, the things we enjoy, our hobbies in life. Satan uses those things and he packages up sin in that way so that it pulls us off track and we start focusing on the wrong thing. And then just like a mouse that is drawn to a little bit of bait, something that looks pretty good, we end up getting caught. We end up going ahead and suffering into the same trap that so many others fall into. This is why Christ goes ahead and warns his disciples. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 37. Turn right there with me. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 37. Here, Christ is going ahead and he's warning his disciples, you need to be careful. You need to be careful because, you know what? A disciple is going to have to carry his cross. He's going to have to go ahead and bear things that no other person is willing to bear. And he says in verse 37, he goes ahead and he says, we'll go back up a little bit. He says in verse 35, "Do not think that I came to bring peace unto the earth, but I came to bring but I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemy will be the members of his own household." What is he saying? He's not saying that, hey, we're just going to have a free-for-all and none of our families are going to be good for us. But what he is saying is there are going to be those who are going to attack, and they're going to be in your own household. There are going to be those that are going to try and steer you off that path, and they're going to be the very ones that you care about the most. And then he says this in verse 37. "He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take up his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me." You see, the simple truth is that we might have to go ahead and deny our very own family. The very closest people in this world to us, they may be the obstacle that we have to overcome. And Christ says, if you're not willing to go ahead and even put those that are the closest in your family aside for me, then you're not worthy to be my disciple. That's pretty tough words. How do we do that? Look with me in 1 Corinthians, because I think Paul helps us to understand exactly how we need to do this. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, Paul has been going ahead and he's saying, look, I've been doing all things so that I can win people to Christ. I've become weak to the weak. I've been going ahead. If there was a person that was Jew, I came down at their level so that they would understand, so I could win them to Christ. And then he says in verse 24, I want you to listen to this as we go through. He says, Do you not know that those who run the race all run, but only one receives a prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the game exercises self-control in all things. Then they then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore, I run in such a way, not as without aim. I box in such a way, not as not beating the air, but I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. What is Paul saying here? Paul gives us and identifies 3 specific ways that we can go ahead and ensure that we're not diverted from our path with Christ. He says, first of all, when we run, we need to run with some enthusiasm. We need to run with urgency. He goes ahead and compares this as one that is running in a race. You know, have you ever looked at a race and you've seen everybody at the start line and they go ahead and they, on your mark, get set, and almost not all the time, but a lot of the time, you will see what's called a false start. A person that is just waiting, just so anxious to get out on that line, past everyone else, that they falsely start. They go before the shot is made. We need to be chomping at the bit. Go as hard as we can. Understand that we are running to win the race, not to be participating in the race. We are supposed to go and move the way that the Lord wants us to, ensuring that we are always keeping our eyes on the goal. And we'll talk about that next. Because the next thing he says is, not only that, you need to exercise self-control. And you need to discipline your body. Paul goes ahead and says, look, there are certain things that we're going to have to pull away from our lives. We're going to have to take them away. No different than any runner, any person that is in sport. When they go ahead, they are regulating every ounce, every carb, every minutia of their meals. They're going ahead and ensuring that their meals are planned and perfectly timed and everything's good. Why? Because it makes them stronger. It helps them. It propels them. It helps them so that they can win. And that's exactly what Paul's saying. We're going to have to tailor our diet. What is coming into our hearts? What are the things that we are going ahead and letting into our lives? We need to tailor those diets. But not only tailor the diets, we then have to go ahead and discipline our bodies. And he talks about as a boxer. And he says, I don't box without aim. I don't just frivolously throw punches and jabs. I'm shooting a jab out so that I can connect. I'm ensuring that what I'm doing with purpose and intent. And that's exactly how we need to do. We need to always be practicing what we preach and then preaching what we practice. I need to train all the time by practicing the word that I learn. In Romans chapter 13, verses 12 to 14, Paul goes ahead and sums it all up in this way. He goes ahead and he says, we need to lay aside the deeds of darkness, behaving properly according to God's will, making, he says, no provision for the flesh. You know, when we think about that, he is saying absolutely nothing, no provision. Give it no sustenance. Allow it nothing special. Do not go ahead and harness it. Do not allow it into your lives. Don't give it even a little bit of a footing. But then he also goes ahead and he says, you need to box with an aim in goal. You need to run that race with a goal. See, Paul, when he was going ahead in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he says, as that runner goes off, he knows what the end goal is. The end goal is the finish line. It's not 4 or 5 steps afterwards. The end goal is not when I get tired, I can go ahead and stop and I've accomplished the race. The accomplishment of the race is when the goal is met. When the race is finished. When I've crossed that line. And here we are told that line for us as Christians, the goal is heaven. The goal is not peace on earth. The goal is not that we go ahead and have a good time here while we're here in this lifetime. The goal is striving so that we can be with our Father in heaven, in His presence for all eternity. The fact is, a river is always battling its surroundings to keep from being diverted and choked off. And there should be absolutely no doubt in our minds that we will have those same pressures in life always attacking our path. Whether it's society that continues to funnel things into our minds or put things in front of us so that it can divert us, it will do everything in its power to go ahead and teach us and try and show us to abandon the faith. At the same time, we discussed our family members, sometimes the very ones that we love, the closest ones to us. They may be the ones who go in front of us and become that stumbling block, become the obstacle that we have to go around. Or it may even be the church, somebody within the church. Look with me in Acts chapter 20, verse 20 to 29 and 30. Acts chapter 20, verses 29 and 30. Here Paul goes ahead and he says that, hold on one second, I just want to make sure that I'm not, no, okay. Acts chapter 20, verse 29 to 30. Here Paul going ahead and he's talking to the church, to the elders at Ephesus. And he goes ahead and he is speaking to the elders at Ephesus and his final kind of remarks before he goes to Jerusalem. He knows that he's not going to be coming back. And as he pulls them together, he tells them in verse 29, I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves men will arise, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after them. Did you hear exactly what Paul just said there? It shouldn't be lost on us that Paul is first and foremost, he's addressing elders. He's addressing men that have met qualifications, the qualifications that we look at when we look in 1 Timothy, as well as when we look in Titus. And he says these men, those men that are called to be shepherds, those that are supposed to be shepherding the flock, those that are supposed to be understanding the word and serving God, from among them, there may be those who arise who are speaking perverse things to draw away disciples. See, if it can happen in an eldership, it can definitely happen in the members within the church. It can definitely happen anywhere around us. And therefore, that's why Paul says we must be on guard for ourselves and for one another. We must always be vigilant. And that is why I continue to stress to you every single time that I come up here and I start to preach. The very first thing I want you to hear is search the scriptures. Look for yourself. Ensure that what I am saying is per the scriptures. Because if it is not, then do not listen to what I'm saying. Follow the word. The word is not fallible. Man, I am fallible. But the next thing that we also see is that a river without movement, it will become stagnant. It will die. And we, in our faith, if we become idle in our faith, we will also suffer a spiritual death. You see, as we talked about in the beginning, that continual movement, the pressure, the drive, the source needs to be strong for that river to continue to move forward and not be choked out by its surroundings. And just as this, in the same manner, Christians must maintain their own spiritual growth, remain active, remain diligent in learning and working for the Lord. Because if we do not, we're going to go ahead and become stagnant. We're going to go ahead and never mature beyond where we were the day before. We will all inevitably fall to spiritual death. You know, Solomon goes ahead and writes about the sluggard in Proverbs chapter 24, verse 30 to 31. And he talks about how he saw this sluggard. The sluggard is just another word for a lazy man. And he says in verse 30 of chapter 24 of Proverbs, he says, I passed the field of a sluggard, and by the vineyard of the man lacking sense, and beheld it was completely overgrown, he says. With thistles, its surface was covered with nettles, and the stones were broken down. And when I saw it, I reflected. And then he goes on and he says in verse 33, a little sleep and a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, then your poverty will come to you, come as a robber, and your want like an armed man. See, within these verses, Paul gives us a strong picture of what laziness can go ahead and lead us into. It can lead us to allowing our spiritual fields to decay, to fall apart around us, to start to deteriorate. Does that describe our spiritual lives? Do we look inwards and then we notice that our fields are haven't been weeded in years. We haven't done anything to get the things that have been attacking our spirituality out of our lives. We are not going ahead and growing, and we are not producing any fruit. Well, then we are like that sluggard man. And if we allow that to happen, then that disrepair, that neglect of the field will eventually lead to not only spiritual immaturity, but it will lead to that spiritual death, forgetting the Lord. Now, we're not going to turn there, but in 2 Kings chapter 22, here we get a picture of a king named Josiah. And Josiah was a young king. And his father and the father before him were bad kings, evil kings, doing things against the Lord. But Josiah was different. Josiah goes ahead and he wants to have the temple repaired. So he sends out for the temple to go ahead and be repaired, all the disrepair to be taken care of. And while they're there, one of the priests that should know the Mosaic law finds the laws of Moses. Finds the Mosaic law and runs this back to Josiah and lets him know we haven't been practicing anything. As they read it, Josiah realizes we haven't been doing the sacrificial offerings to God. We haven't been practicing the things that we're supposed to. We haven't been going ahead and following what God has already commanded. And Josiah rips and tears his robe and then cries to the Lord and have them go ahead and start. Inquire for the Lord what we should do and then begin those sacrifices. Do the things that we're supposed to. You see, the problem here was that the people had gone so long with this stagnation, had gone so long without maturity that even the priests of the temple had forgotten the law of the Lord. And that can easily happen to us. You know, the Hebrew writer, if you turn there in Hebrews chapter 5, the Hebrew writer tells us something very important. He goes ahead and he is talking about those that he's been talking about Melchizedek. And he goes ahead and he says, I want to tell you more about this man, Melchizedek, and why it's so important to you. But he says, it's hard to explain. And you have become, he says, dull of hearing in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 11. They have allowed themselves to become dull of hearing, not being sharp anymore to what they've been listening to. And he says, for though, in verse 12, by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need for someone again to teach you the elementary principles of the oracle of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is an infant. But solid food is for the mature, who because of their practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil. And then in verse 6 he says, therefore, knowing this, leaving the elementary teachings about Christ, let us press on to maturity. We need to be struggling, being diligent to go ahead and press on to maturity. Let us never forget that a demonstration of our faith is necessary. We talked about that this morning. We have to understand that it isn't just simple, or it isn't just good enough to go ahead and say, you know what, I have faith in the Lord, but I do absolutely nothing to demonstrate that faith. We must demonstrate our faith because James tells us without demonstration of our faith, without the works behind that faith, then it is dead. But you know what? Paul goes ahead and that's why he says, I press for that goal. I press for the upward goal to heaven. You see, that's what we need to go ahead and do. But lastly, the last characteristic, the last trait that I want to talk about is that all rivers flow to an outlet. They all end up somewhere. And as Christians, we too, eventually, whether we're Christian or non-Christian, we will all end up at a final outlet. Now, where that takes us, it all depends on the route that we take, the route that we go ahead and follow. What's the path? You see, this is an absolute. There is no deviation from this. Christ, when talking in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 through 14, he goes ahead and he says this, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who will enter through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow for those for that leads to life, and there are few who will find it. You see, we will either find eternal life or eternal condemnation. That is the only two paths that we have. And God, Christ, through His Word, the Word that the Lord has given to us through Christ, leads us to eternal salvation, leads us to heaven. But we have to follow that path. It's being predetermined, as Paul goes ahead and states. It is a path that is set in stone. We have to just follow it. But if we deviate from it, we are no more or no less than those within the world who ignore it completely. Yes, we are all heading to one eternal destination, whether it's life or death. But sometimes we look at that and we say, well, which one is it? How do I know I'm going to the right place or the wrong place? And we kind of doubt our salvation. But Paul didn't doubt his salvation. Paul said he hadn't acquired it yet. He hadn't gotten there yet. But he also said in Romans chapter 8, verse 1, there is now therefore no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. There's no condemnation. So when we look at this, Paul is saying, I'm assured. I'm assured of my salvation. Why is Paul assured of his salvation, but he says, I haven't obtained it yet? Because Paul understands he's still on that road. Paul understood that if he deviates, if he goes ahead and decided at the last moment, you know what, I'm not doing what Christ tells me. I'm not doing what the Lord says. I'm not doing the word of the Lord. I have the rest, all those days, all those years that I have before me, that'll count. Then he wouldn't have achieved that. He would not have come because the Lord would not have accepted him. We need to understand the same thing applies for us as well. You see, we're told specifically that hope is the assurance of things hoped for, or that faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. And that without faith, without true belief, then it's impossible to please God. So my question to you is, do you have faith in your salvation? Do you believe that you're going to be saved? You see, sometimes we get that question and we don't like to answer it. We start thinking, you know what, if I say yes, people are going to go ahead and say, well, how could you believe that? But you see, Paul had faith in his salvation. Why? Because he had faith not in himself. He had faith in the blood of Christ. He had faith in God's promises. He had faith in this word, and he knew if I don't deviate from that path, the Lord says that I will end up in heaven, and therefore I will end up in heaven. And we have to be the exact same way. So, as we've seen, there are indeed some vital lessons that we can go ahead and take from the life of a tree, life of a river, not a tree. If that's a different lesson. So the life of a river. And how we draw makes a difference. Where we go and what we do makes a difference. So when we go ahead and look at our lives, our spiritual lives, we must always remember that we draw strength from God and God alone. That we cannot allow ourselves to be diverted. We must walk the path that the Lord has given to us and only that path. We cannot become idle in our work and decide, you know what, I'm just too tired to do this. You know what, I don't feel like going to church. I don't feel like doing this. I don't feel like reading the scriptures. I don't feel like praying. And then finally, we need to understand we are all going to reach an eternal destination. So here's my question to you. What does your spiritual river look like today? Where is it heading? You see, if we dig deep enough, if we look in our hearts, the simple truth is we can come up with that answer pretty quickly. If you're one who has not accepted Christ as your Lord and Savior, has not accepted the gospel call, I will tell you right now, you are not on the right path. But the beauty is that the Lord has given you this moment, this opportunity, right here, right now, to go ahead and change that. But if you have accepted the gospel and look at the river of your spiritual life and start noticing, it's meandering pretty good. I'm being cut off. from the things of the Word. Why not make a recommitment today? Why not change that life today? If there is any way that we can help you, we can pray for you, we can go ahead and look at the Scriptures together, let us do that on your behalf. If there is any who is subject to the invitation, please come forward as we stand and sing the song of encouragement.